September 1886. An obscure railroad watering stop in Texas. These are Apache warriors, Geronimo's Apaches, and this is Geronimo himself, perhaps the most feared Indian who has ever lived. Sitting here with him are the relatives of Victorio, Mangus Coloradus, and Cochise, each a name that echoes through history. These 18 people are among the last of the great Apache warriors, the tigers of the human species, according to one U.S. general. They have lost their battle for freedom, but they have survived. Now they're headed east to Florida, to captivity. For the settlers living in the American Southwest and northern Mexico, their departure has not come soon enough.
I saw them kill my mother and my 2 little brothers by beating their brains out with stones. They took my father and tortured him most dreadfully. An Indian squaw saved my life by holding me behind her and begging them to spare me.
They were the one that first started that. The white people, killing them off. And they were the savages, not the Indians.
Whoever started the terror, whoever initiated the bloodshed, this journey is the end of it. The Apaches have been forced to relinquish their part of the Southwest. But their fight for survival is an unforgettable chapter of American history. The American Southwest. In the 18th century, it is home to an extraordinary variety of native peoples: Pueblos, Navajos, Papagos, Hopis, Mojaves. But one tribe stands out by fighting for its freedom and its homeland with more tenacity and more ferocity than any other. Their name comes from the Zuni word for enemy. They are the Apaches.
When you say Apache, you're talking about a whole nation of Apache. It's not just one tribe of Apache. You go to the east from Oklahoma, you go all the way across New Mexico into Arizona, northern Mexico, and that's all Apache country.
James Kawikla, whose words preserve the Apache oral tradition, talks about the ways of his people and their God.
Before the coming of the White Eyes, my people spent their summers in the mountains of New Mexico, carefree, untrammeled. They migrated to Mexico in the fall, living off the land as they went, killing game, harvesting fruit, and giving thanks to Yusen for the good things he had given.
The Apaches bend every aspect of their environment to their needs and to their military advantage, training their children to survive under almost any conditions, especially war.
When they fought, one of the ways they were taught very young was to dash back and forth like this. And Papa said that he had seen many times warriors would dash back and forth with somebody shooting at them, and they could go up and take a rifle out of somebody's hands, out of the shooter's hands.
In the 1600s, Spanish immigrants begin settling in northern Mexico in Apache territory. Their very presence leads to friction and resentment. Their possessions and their wealth are an irresistible lure. Again and again, Apache warriors swoop down on nearby towns and ranches, stealing livestock, taking hostages, and killing anyone who resists.
The Apaches were not necessarily out to go out and kill people on these raids. It wasn't the point of the raids. It was to acquire property and supplies.
Los labradores tenían que escoger su rifle.
The workers had to take their rifles into the field. If they left their rifle at one end of the field to free their hands for driving the team of oxen to plow the soil, the Apaches appeared, picked up that very rifle, and killed the men.
The Mexicans retaliate in kind, the deadly pattern repeating itself endlessly over generations. Thousands of Mexicans and Apaches die violent deaths, and both peoples grow to despise and fear each other. The Mexicans even offer cash rewards for Apache scalps. And in 1839, they hire a bloodthirsty mercenary, James Kirker, and his men. Their orders: kill every Apache they can find. Mexican volunteers and soldiers lead the effort.
The Mexicans were always our enemy. They may have gone in and traded with them, but they were never to be trusted. They were treacherous, they were vicious, they were mean, they were all the bad things that you can think of.
One Mexican attack on an Apache camp in northern Mexico has consequences that will echo throughout the Southwest, because it involves a young Apache warrior called Geronimo. Geronimo later speaks of it.
Late one afternoon, when returning from town, we were met by a few women and children who told us that Mexican troops from some other town had attacked our camp, killed all the warriors of the guard, captured all our ponies, and killed many of our women and children. I found that my aged mother, my young wife, and my 3 small children were among the slain. Whenever I saw anything to remind me of former happy days, my heart would ache for revenge upon Mexico.
The Apaches spread destruction throughout northern Mexico, overwhelming their foe with sheer ferocity and superior tactics.
Apaches were masters at guerrilla warfare, at every form of guerrilla warfare, at moving rapidly across a hostile landscape, at living on the land, so that they were virtually impossible to trap.
The Apache attacks are so unrelenting that they drive settlers from large parts of the Mexican state of Sonora.
They said the Apaches came out at night to trap them, bringing death and destruction to everything they touched.
But the world the Apaches know is changing dramatically. They are now about to confront a very different group of people, settlers from the United States. Between 1846 and 1848, during the Mexican-American War, The U.S. annexes all the territory between the Rio Grande and the Pacific Ocean. The Army builds forts in the area, and the Apaches leave Americans in peace. But settlers continue to arrive. The Butterfield stagecoach line begins operation, running right through Apache Pass. And gold is discovered in the heart of Apache territory, luring thousands of prospectors. For these people, the Apaches are just one more obstacle.
You begin to understand that they didn't want you there. If there are savages in the way, then we have no use for the savages, because all they do is kill you. And very broadly and to the point, that's the way the Apaches were looked at.
During this period, two forceful and impressive men are at the forefront of Apache leadership. One is the chief of the Warm Springs Apache of southern New Mexico, Mangus Coloradus, Red Sleeves, a man of legendary strength and wisdom whose influence stretches far beyond his own people. Mangus allies himself to the chief of a neighboring band, the Chiricahua, by marrying a daughter to him. This chief will become one of the most famous and most powerful in Apache history. His name is Cochise.
As a leader, as a fighting leader of his people, he was incomparable. And practically every fight that we know he participated in, he was at the forefront of his warriors, leading them into battle.
(1861). With growing numbers of settlers moving into Apache territory, the Army is finding it harder and harder to protect them. Now something happens that makes that task impossible.
A young boy, 12-year-old boy, was kidnapped, apparently by Apaches, and taken north. So the commander of Fort Buchanan dispatched a young lieutenant, Lieutenant George Bascom, to go and retrieve the boy. Use force if necessary, but use his judgment and bring the boy back.
Summoned by Bascom, Cochise comes to Apache Pass, accompanied by his brother and other relatives. Asa Doclugi, whose father was a friend of Cochise, tells what happened then.
He denied his band had done the kidnapping, but offered to help restore the child. The young officer informed Cochise that he and his party would not be released until the boy was produced. With his knife, Cochise cut a slit in the tent and escaped. The chief captured some white men to exchange for his family.
But Cochise becomes convinced Bascom is negotiating in bad faith, so he kills his hostages. Bascom retaliates by hanging Cochise's brother and some of his other relatives.
Cochise lost some of his family, and I think he prized his family. He loved his family and would go to any extreme to do what he had to do, whether it was revenge, or not. I think it was just a sense of getting even.
Cochise does get even. He will spend the next decade making all-out war on everything American. Apache Springs, in what will become southeast Arizona. In this parched land, it is among the Apaches' most reliable watering holes. Now, because it is on the main route to California, it is about to be the scene of a crucial battle between the Apaches and the U.S. Army. July 1862. The Civil War is raging back east. The vanguard of General James Carleton's 3,000-man army is heading to New Mexico to reclaim it from the Confederates. They are marching toward Apache Springs, badly in need of water. They are also marching into a trap.
They didn't realize that Cochise and his father-in-law, Mangus Coloradus, were up here on the ridge above the spring.
The two great chiefs have assembled an unprecedented force, perhaps 300 warriors, and set up an ambush, building rocky breastworks to protect themselves from Army rifle fire. As the soldiers enter the trap, the Apaches strike. The surprise is total, but the attack doesn't go as planned. Coahuila recounts the story.
The chiefs would have had an easy victory had the White Eyes not produced a new and terrible weapon, cannon. Shells crashed into the hillsides upon which they lay concealed, dislodging stone and sending earth crashing down the slopes. The Apaches withdrew, carrying their wounded.
Never again, after this one crucial battle, would the Apache have control of Apache Spring, because very soon afterwards, the Army decided that they had to build a fort at Apache Pass.
The Union commander, General Carleton, angered by previous Apache attacks on U.S. settlers, now decides he must solve the Indian problem once and for all. Carleton's policies have a tragic impact on one of the most powerful Apache chiefs, Mangus Coloradus.
Finally, he came in one day thinking he was parleying with the Americans, and instead the soldiers drew their weapons and captured him.
He was trying to save what was left of his people. They were being killed and chased and harassed.
A civilian on guard duty, Daniel Ellis Connor, witnesses what happens that night.
About 9 o'clock, I noticed the soldiers were doing something to Mangus, but quit when I returned to the fire. Watching them from my beat in the outer darkness, I discovered they were heating their bayonets and burning Mangus's feet and legs. This they continued to do until Mangus rose up upon his left elbow, angrily protesting that he was no child to be played with. Thereupon, the two soldiers each quickly fired into the chief. Mangus fell back into the same position and never moved.
Enraged by Mangus's murder and still grieving at the hanging of his relatives, Cochise plunders and pillages American settlements and ranches, spreading terror throughout the Southwest. The Tucson papers are filled with citizens' complaints.
The Indians are robbing us from 2 to 3 times a week regularly. And in self-preservation, we must kill them wherever found.
For more than a decade, Cochise eludes the troops and volunteers of 4 states and 2 countries, leapfrogging national boundaries and hiding in secret and inaccessible mountain strongholds. White men say it's luck, but the Apaches have another word for it: power.
It was given to you, and you alone. The people see it in you. Your actions, your reactions, your behavior.
Unable to catch Cochise, frustrated settlers take out their wrath on any other Apaches they can find.
The Tucson people simply had no use for Indians and would have preferred an out-and-out policy of extermination. And this mindset was very graphically illustrated in the Camp Grant massacre.
One peaceful band of Apaches, about 500 strong, has settled at Camp Grant, a feeding station meant to provide safety and nourishment. But their proximity is too much for some Tucson citizens who hire Indian and Mexican mercenaries to kill as many as possible. They attacked the sleeping camp at dawn on April 30th, 1871. One of the organizers is W.S. Urey.
We never witnessed a prettier skirmish in all our military life. For in less than half an hour, not a living Apache was to be seen. Thus ended the so-called Camp Grant massacre, in the killing of about 144 of the most bloodthirsty devils that ever disgraced Mother Earth.
The Tucson citizens behind the Camp Grant massacre are proud of their handiwork. But back east, there is shame and outrage. Reacting to the public furor, President Grant sends an emissary to the Southwest to try to make peace with the Apaches, and particularly the most powerful Apache of them all, Cochise. He chooses General Oliver O. Howard, a Civil War hero known for his sympathetic work with freed slaves. But in order to reach Cochise, Howard needs help.
I remember my mother talking about Tom Jeffords, that Cochise referred to him as Dagatlitun, which means red beard.
Cochise had established a friendship with a white man named Tom Jeffords. Jeffords was a prospector and mail rider.
I think that was one of the strongest relationships that Cochise ever had with any non-Indian.
Settlers consider Cochise a lying, bloodthirsty savage. Jeffords comes to a different conclusion.
I found Cochise to be a man of great natural ability. He respected me, and I respected him. His religion was truth and loyalty.
In the autumn of 1872, General Howard bravely or naively travels with Jeffords to a remote area of southeast Arizona in the Dragoon Mountains. There he meets the legendary chief.
At one meeting, they were in Cochise's camp, and Howard saw a rifle with the name of an American officer who had been killed by the Chiricahua. And Cochise eyed Howard, and he could tell what Howard was thinking. And he said to Howard in Spanish, he said, "You know, General, we do things in war that we don't do in peace."
It isn't just his trust of Howard that leads Cochise to make peace. He knows he has no other option.
Cochise was getting old, and his spirit was getting dull, getting dim. And he knew that he had to make some decision in order for his people to survive. I think that was the most important thing in his life, that his people would continue to live.
Cochise's anguish is evident in his words.
Nobody wants peace more than I do. I have killed 10 white men for every Indian I have lost, but still the white men are no less, and my tribe keeps growing smaller and smaller, till it will disappear from the face of the earth if we do not have a good peace soon.
Howard and Cochise never commit their bargain to paper, but it gives Cochise and his people a reservation in their traditional homeland, in and around Apache Pass, with Tom Jeffords as agent. Cochise keeps his promise not to raid American settlements, but just 2 years later, he falls ill and dies. Jeffords is present at the burial.
He was dressed in his best war garments, decorated with war paint and head feathers, and wrapped in a splendid, heavy red woolen blanket. It was then placed on his favorite horse, which was guided to a lonely place among the rocks and chasms. The horse was killed and dropped into the depths. Cochise's favorite dog, his gun, and other arms were then thrown in. And last, Cochise was lowered with lariats into the rocky sepulcher.
1875. Cochise's Chiricahua, living near Apache Pass, are leaving U.S. settlers alone. The Warm Springs Band, now led by a warrior named Victorio, is living on a reservation in their ancestral homeland. But the U.S. government decides all the Apache bands should be moved to a single reservation.
And so therefore the solution was to establish an agency and a reservation called San Carlos in the Gila River Valley, the hot and malarial and sand-blasted and sterile Gila River Basin, where no human being who had any choice in the matter would elect to settle.
Washington orders John Clum, the San Carlos Indian agent, to bring all Apaches to San Carlos. With the help of his newly formed Native American police force, Clum corrals hundreds of Apaches, including a troublemaker named Geronimo. But less than half of the Chiricahuas obey Clum's command. And Victorio's band is even more resistant. James Kawikla.
Victorio said, "I will not go to San Carlos. I will not take my people there. We prefer to die in our own land under the tall, cool pines. We will leave our bones with those of our people. It is better to die fighting than to starve."
Finally, in 1879, Victorio just threw up his hands and went to war. He simply declared war by falling on a military herd guard of cavalry, killing the cavalrymen and running off with the horses. And thus he inaugurated one of the most extraordinary and costly and bloody and exhausting Indian wars that the United States had to fight.
Commanding about 150 fighting men, Victorio darts about the southwest and northern Mexico with lightning speed, cutting down isolated sheep herders, settlers, and travelers. Both the U.S. and the Mexican armies try to run him down. But running down Victorio is no easy task, since, like his predecessors, he is a master of guerrilla warfare.
Our numbers were never really great. If we could lead them up into areas that would be at our advantage, into our strongholds, and then up and through canyons that we wouldn't even have to use ammunition, that we would just use nature's own weapons and use rocks and avalanches to our advantages.
Even when the Apaches were being pursued on foot or on horses, they traveled like 75 miles a day, and the soldiers on horses travel only 35 to 40 miles a day. You know, that tells you a lot why they weren't very successful, is because, you know, they always stopped to rest. And the Apaches, all he did was move on and, you know, even probably till his horse fell, but yet he continued on foot.
Victorio is perhaps the greatest Apache military leader. He knows instinctively what West Point takes years to teach. Fortify your position. Fight from high ground. Keep rough country at your rear to slow your enemy's pursuit if you must retreat. But even genius cannot forever fight off superior numbers and superior arms. By October 1880, after a year of fighting and running and thwarting both the U.S. and the Mexican army, Victorio's time is running out. He and his men are tired, hungry, and short of ammunition. Forced into Mexico by the black troops of the 9th and 10th Cavalries, they are unaware the Mexican army is waiting for them.
In the end, it was a Mexican force that trapped Victorio, and at the Battle of Tres Castillos wiped out most of his following and killed him personally.
One of those who survives the battle is a little boy named James Kawikla.
We found the chief with his own knife in his heart. His ammunition belt was empty. The others had been killed by Mexicans. Victorio had died as he would have wished, in the defense of his people.
But Victorio's death is hardly the end of Apache resistance. Another Apache leader is about to make his mark on history. A man who embodies the very essence of the Apache fighting spirit. Geronimo. 1881. Geronimo and his people are living at San Carlos in misery and fear, dealing with malaria, corrupt agents, and trigger-happy soldiers.
You're taken out of your environment and placed in an artificial area. And our people just didn't understand why they were treated that way, and they began fighting this kind of thing.
In September, after soldiers kill a revered medicine man, Geronimo breaks out of the reservation with 74 warriors and several hundred women and children. They head for the Sierra Madre Mountains in Mexico. There they are joined by Victorio's surviving warriors.
Geronimo was a superb warrior, an excellent leader, a man noted for his abilities to prophesy, what we'd call extrasensory perception, but also endowed with a rather disagreeable personality that made him not entirely venerated by most of his people.
But the people who live and fight with Geronimo admire him. Jasper Cancia is apprenticed to one of Geronimo's warriors.
When his people were hungry, Geronimo got food. When they were cold, he provided blankets and clothing. When they were afoot, he stole horses. When they had no bullets, he got ammunition. He was a good man. I think you have desperados among you white eyes today that are much worse men and more cruel than Geronimo.
Geronimo makes his headquarters in the Sierra Madre. For generations, its steep sides, towering peaks, and plunging gorges have provided the Apaches with an impregnable fortress and a secure base for raiding in any direction. A young mescalero boy who was with Geronimo at the time remembers the terror on both sides.
When Geronimo crossed the border into New Mexico or Arizona, it was usually to get ammunition. But if he were seen by a civilian, it meant that it would be reported to the military and they'd be after us. So there was nothing to do but kill the civilian and his entire family. It was terrible to see little children killed. I do not like to talk of it. I do not like to think of it. But the soldiers killed our women and children too. Don't forget that.
The American citizens of the Southwest, outraged and terrified, demand that their government protect them from Geronimo's attacks. But hitting Geronimo in his Sierra Madre refuge has always proved impossible. Washington gives the task to a brilliant Indian fighter, General George Crook. Crook has great respect for the Apaches, but he is determined to take the battle directly to Geronimo. General George Crook. In past campaigns, he has been more successful in subduing Apaches than any other Army officer. One reason, his profound respect for their fighting abilities.
We have before us the tiger of the human species, To see them, as they first appeared to the white men, half-clad, half-fed, it was easy to believe that nothing could be more easily effected than their extermination or subjugation. It has taken the expenditure of countless treasure and blood to demonstrate these naked Indians were the most thoroughly individualized soldier on the globe, that each was an army in himself.
General Crook puts 80 companies of infantry and cavalry in the field. But it is his innovative idea to use Apache scouts from bands unfriendly to Geronimo to guide him to the leader's stronghold.
He was the one that figured out the only way to catch an Apache is with an Apache, because there was no other way that he could have caught our people without incorporating some of our own, and he knew this.
Crook also comes up with the second innovation in Indian warfare, using mules for transport instead of wagon trains. They let Crook and his men penetrate the canyons and gorges of the Sierra Madre, where Geronimo has always felt safe. Stunned that his enemies have invaded his sanctuary, Geronimo agrees to try reservation life again. But he and his warriors, unable to live in confinement, run away to the Sierra Madre a second time. Once again, he crosses the border to raid American settlements. And once again, Crook uses scouts to run him down. This time from Geronimo's very own band. March 1886. Geronimo agrees to a parley. He and Crook meet in Cañon de los Embudos, Mexico. Both sides armed and ready for treachery. After 3 days of threats and promises, it all comes down to a few simple words.
You must make up your mind whether you'll stay out on the warpath or surrender. If you stay out, I'll keep after you and kill the last one. If it takes 50 years.
But for Geronimo, the end is here.
2 or 3 words are enough. I give myself up to you. Do with me what you please. I surrender. Once I moved about like the wind. Now I surrender to you. And that is all.
Geronimo's warriors also agree to surrender on the condition they'll be imprisoned briefly, then allowed to go home. But that night, a whiskey peddler convinces the Indians the U.S. will never honor Crook's promises. Once more, Geronimo runs off to the Sierra Madre, taking 20 warriors and their families. Army Commander Philip Sheridan is furious. He orders Crook to cancel his agreement with Geronimo and demand unconditional surrender.
General Crook simply couldn't swallow the orders that he had been given. He asked to be relieved of his command, which must have been a shattering blow to a man of his ego.
General Nelson Miles now assumes command. Miles arrogantly abandons Crook's tactics and sends out 5,000 soldiers, a quarter of the U.S. Army, to run down Geronimo and his people. They fail to kill or capture a single hostile Apache. But Miles' next move will prove decisive. Intent on depriving Geronimo of potential reinforcements and support, he orders all the reservation Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apaches shipped by train to Florida. Eugene Chihuahua later recalls the scene.
We had seen trains, of course, but I was afraid of the engine. When it screeched and came snorting to that platform, It seemed to me as if it squatted and crouched as though about to pounce on us. I don't know what day it was when they drove us on that thing. Everybody was miserable.
I think we're the only people where they took the mothers, the grandmothers, grandfathers, and husbands and wives and everybody. They took the whole tribe, not just the men or just those that were fighting. They took everybody, innocent and all.
Geronimo and his warriors still consider running from the army. Jasper Cancia, a member of Geronimo's little band, expresses the mood at the time. His grandson Burl remembers his words.
He said, as we were top of the hill, we looked out over the blue mountains, the blue haze, and he said one of the comments were that we could run and be lost in the blue haze in the mountains. No one will ever find us or catch us.
Miles sends Lieutenant Charles Gatewood, an officer liked and trusted by the Apaches, to win Geronimo's surrender. 2 scouts from Geronimo's own band precede Gatewood, risking their lives to ask the Apache leader to see him. Gatewood informs Geronimo that his people have been sent far away to Florida.
Geronimo laid his Winchester rifle down and shook hands. It took but a few minutes to say, "Surrender and you will be sent to join the rest of your people in Florida to await the decision of the president. Accept these terms or fight it out to the bitter end." Then Geronimo passed a hand across his eyes and, extending both arms forward and making his hands tremble, asked me if I had anything to drink.
September 4th, 1886. Geronimo and his little group of holdouts, the men, women, and children who have run the U.S. Army ragged, come to Skeleton Canyon, Arizona, as agreed, to meet with General Miles.
He knew that his tribe would be just annihilated because they were killing everybody, killing the whole tribe, and he didn't want it to disappear from the face of the earth. So he said the only way he could do that was to save his people, was to surrender.
A few days later, troops put Geronimo and his people aboard a train. They even ship out the Apache scouts who have served the U.S. Army so well.
When that Southern Pacific locomotive puffed out of the station at Bowie, Arizona, bearing Geronimo and his final little band of holdouts on the long journey back to Florida, the Apache Wars came to an end. 4 centuries of Indian warfare in the United States came to an end.
Geronimo has been promised, first by Crook, then by Miles, that he and his people will serve 2 years of captivity, then be returned to a reservation in their homeland. What happens to them, however, is very different. They are first confined in Fort Marion and Fort Pickens, Florida. 2 years later, they are transferred to Mount Vernon Barracks, Alabama. 7 years after that, they are taken to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In the midst of their captivity, their children are taken from them to be educated in the white man's ways at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. The government tries to make farmers and ranchers out of the former warriors. Many accept their new role while doing their best to maintain their culture and traditions. But others resent white men's attempts to impose their culture. James Coaitla.
Their alibi is that they wish to civilize us. That means they want to make thieves and liars of us like themselves. We will become weak and useless from the illness and vices of the white eyes.
Many Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apaches die prematurely as prisoners of war. And on February 17, 1909, Geronimo passes away at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, far from his homeland. It is the end of an era. Mescalero, New Mexico. This is where most of the Apaches came in 1913 after 27 years of captivity. Most built good lives for themselves here. In recent years, groups of Apaches have visited Mexico to see where their ancestors lived and fought and died.
I just know I come from a ragged, ragged bunch of Indians.
Against the odds, they are maintaining their traditions and their cultural identity. But it is unlikely they will ever reclaim their homeland.
It saddens me that a people that went through so much, that fought so hard for the country that they love, and yet today there is no Chiricahua reservation. And that's what saddens me.
You needed to fall back on something that you are most familiar with, which is deep down inside, that was never stripped from our people, which is spirituality.
I think we're strong people because all our lives we had to fight to survive, and we still do it. We're still doing it in a different sense of the word. We're still survivors.